I would like to introduce our first speaker of the morning. Virginia Parks is an associate professor in the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. She teaches courses in policy formulation and implementation and in community organizing and development. Her fields of special interest include urban geography, urban labor markets, immigration, racial and gender inequality, residential segregation, and community organizing and development. In her research, Professor Parks analyzes the patterns and ramifications of spatial inequality, particularly as they manifest in urban environments at the intersections of race, ethnicity, and gender. Her primary interest is in how space and place bring about and mediate labor market outcomes, such as unemployment and low-wage work for immigrants, native-born minorities, and women. A central concern informing Professor Parks' research and teaching is how local communities can respond to these patterns of inequality through various organizing and development efforts. Professor Parks received her PhD in geography at the University of California, Los Angeles. Before her life as an academic, she worked as a community organizer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Virginia Parks.
Thanks, Jamie, and thank all of you for showing up bright and early on the last day of your conference, or institute, I guess you're calling it. As you know, I'm trained as an urban geographer. I also have an MA in urban planning. My central focus is looking at employment, and so as part of that, you can't but not look at immigration if you're concerned about U.S. employment patterns. So that's primarily how I come at this issue, and I'm going to be talking exclusively today about the U.S. context. So what I wanted to do, and I was thinking about your students and how do you contextualize these political questions that we hear played out almost daily in the news media and in conversations and other fora. So I thought it would be good to do a brief overview of the primary theories that particularly people like me, geographers, sociologists, political scientists, and some economists work with. Economists almost exclusively are dealing with neoclassical economic theory. The rest of us sort of blend these theories in our approach to a number of these questions. Broadly, we think about what drives immigration or migration patterns, particularly from an economic viewpoint, as a result of push-pull factors. So this is a good place to start. It's a good place to start with students. It's very broad, though. So this covers a range of factors, from economic concerns of extreme unemployment in ascending country, to political upheaval that may push people out, to, as you've been talking about, climate refugees. But we think of push-pull factors as being, again, overly general, and more recent theories have been able to specify these factors within a much more defined set of parameters. So the three theoretical approaches that I'm going to introduce today are first, neoclassical economic theory, secondly, what we call dual labor market theory, and thirdly, world systems theory. To begin, this is neoclassical economic theory. This is the theoretical terrain upon which most economists in the academy are working from. Really, these questions are driven by issues of supply and demand. These are the types of questions that really, I think, dominate public policy discussions today. At the macro level, economists talk about migration from low-wage to high-wage markets. And so the critical criterion is the wage, the expected wage of the migrant. So the migrant then evaluates his or her, what we call human capital. That's your bundle of skills. We usually use education as a proxy for that, but also tenure in the labor market is important. And you evaluate where you're going to get the best return on that set of skills. And this will then prompt, the theory says, a migrant to move from a lower wage market to a higher wage market. Now, eventually, this is always the end goal, right? In any neoclassical economic theoretical domain, you will reach equilibrium. So wages will eventually equalize between markets and between countries, and that will put a stop to migrant flows. So at the micro level, what's undergirding this then is what I had just talked about. It's a cost-benefit decision on the part of the individual. Migration is seen as an investment, actually, in one's human capital. So the costs, the real monetary costs, as well as the psychic costs, are included in these models. And the question is, will I gain at the margin by moving to a higher wage market given the cost that migration imposes? So the question that drives this is, where will I get the maximum return on my set of skills? So then we get some debates. Even though this is the dominant, neoclassical economic theory is the dominant theoretical domain, particularly in the economics field, there are other economists, particularly behavioral economists, so they don't usually fit in a dual labor market theory camp, and then others in the academy who question, one, whether markets truly ever come to equilibrium. That's one of the main assumptions that undergirds neoclassical economic theory that these other scholars call into question. The other assumption of neoclassical models that other scholars call into question is the idea of full information, that migrants really know what the expected wage will be, right? You're, as a rational actor, you can map the world and you can see, oh, for janitorial work, I'll get X in the Netherlands, I'll get Y in France, I'll get so much in the US, and then you base your decision upon that. So the folks who then are critical of neoclassical economic theory usually start with those sorts of questions. Here's dual labor market theory. In the scholarly literature, there's a very famous book called Birds of Passage by Piori, and that's really the most elegant summation of this theoretical approach. So the idea is that migration stems from a permanent intrinsic labor demands of modern capitalist societies and economies. That basically there will always be a demand for low-wage workers, regardless. And we need to somehow fill those low-wage jobs with workers, and those workers will inevitably be immigrants. The reason for is that workers work not only for monetary reward, but also for status reward. And in modern capitalist societies, these low-wage jobs take on lower status. And that's one of the important reasons in dual labor market theory that natives will shun those jobs, is because they don't bestow status upon the holder. So there will always, as a result, be a demand for a supply of workers to fill these low-wage jobs. Why is it called dual labor market theory? Well, these theorists assume that the labor market is divided into two separate segments, right? And there's no porosity between them. So once you're in one segment of the labor market, particularly the secondary labor market, it's very hard to move into the primary segment of the labor market. What kind of jobs are in the primary sector of the labor market? Well, these are stable jobs with tenure, usually with some degree of stability and security, good pay, opportunities for advancement, and recognized social status. Now, I think it's important to understand that there are a number of social and political conditions that make these jobs primary jobs. I'm going to use teaching as an example. Teaching is considered, particularly in secondary schools, a job in the primary labor market. Now, what are some of the things that ensure that those jobs are primary segment jobs? Well, there's usually security, there's job security. Why? Because usually you have some sort of a contract, especially if you have a union contract, that's an even stronger guarantee of that sort of job security, right? There are usually then rules that protect you from fire without cause, for instance, right? You have a pension or some sort of retirement. These are all the kinds of goods that get wrapped up into a primary labor market or a primary segment job. Secondary jobs, then, you can imagine, are just the opposite. They are unstable, they pay very low wages, there are no or limited opportunities to advance, and there's low social skills. Now, the reason that I put regardless of skill on this slide in parentheses, Because what we see often in these jobs is that regardless of your skill level, there's a ceiling at which there's a ceiling on that return to skills, so basically the wage. So if you're to have a curve, right, and you're looking at years on the job and education, at some point you just plateau. So even if I, with a PhD, were to take a janitorial job, there's a certain ceiling of a wage return that I'll receive in that job. There's just no way for me to push that wage up even as I increase my education or even years on the job. So then the idea is what I started out with is that natives usually shun jobs in the secondary sector and immigrants are needed as a labor supply into these secondary sector jobs. One thing that I do think is important here that's become a more sort of contemporary discussion around dual labor market theory that's not represented in this the original version of the theory is this acknowledgement of the social and political factors that go into making primary segment jobs. And I think we're beginning to see a fraying at the edges around the primary segment of the labor market. And the reason I use teachers is because I think that's an example. If you look at teachers in private secondary schools, it depends. Are they unionized or they're not? Here at lab school, they're union, that's a protection. Other schools, no, you're not, or charter schools. And we see much lower wages for those teachers and much, the conditions of work may be very similar across, but the security of that job is much lower than a job in a public school. So you're working on a contract, yearly contracts rather than longer term contracts. And so we can see how primary sector jobs can easily become secondary segment jobs if we begin unraveling these protections that make those jobs primary segment jobs. Okay, lastly, world systems theory. This theoretical domain positions migration within a global economic system. So rather than just viewing migration within the parameters of a labor market analysis, or a nation state analysis, we really expand out and understand migration as a global process. This really is the theoretical position that is most dominant in fields in the academy like sociology, particularly anthropology, geography. The argument here is that the penetration of capitalist production relations beyond the industrial core, so these are Western industrialized countries and Japan primarily, beyond the boundaries of those countries prompts migration flows. So we're seeing then as global capital moves into the developing world in a drive for higher profits, capitalist firms disrupt internal socioeconomic systems of those countries. This gives rise, and there's a huge literature around what might be the different mechanisms. People have looked at agricultural markets, that now subsistence level farmers, or it's actually not necessarily subsistence level farmers. It's usually farmers who are producing part of their crop for cash. So that market is disrupted because of the entrance of global capital that drives down prices in the market. Now those workers can't earn a living on that cash crop anymore. They're left without a livelihood. They seek work elsewhere. Or in another version, this is Saskia Sassen's work on global cities particularly, but she looks at the larger conditions of migration. You have, again, some disruption in the agricultural market, a need for family members, additional family members to enter the labor market who haven't had before, particularly women she's interested in. They take work in the maquiladoras, but now they've already been exposed to that the situation of migration. They've experienced migration. They've actually left home to work in a border town in a maquiladora. They now have experience working in a factory, and they say, well, wait a second, I know, because this product is being produced for the American market, I know that there are jobs in the US that are similar to this job, and they pay more. So I'm already a migrant, why not cross the border and make even more money to then send back home? So this is it can get very complex, the number of different stories, but the idea here is that it's a global capitalist system that's really driving migration flows, and that even as migrants, it may seem as though they're addressing an internal issue in their own country of low wages or no employment opportunities. That quote-unquote internal condition is really caused by the penetration of global capital into that country. I think the last thing are the typical conditions of globalization that we often talk about. Why do we have globalization? Two of the main reasons are that we have increases in transportation, or we have improvements in transportation technology and communications, which allows then the flow of goods and information rather cheaply across the globe. Okay, so when we think about economic effects, there are a whole host of issues to talk about. And when Jamie asked me to speak, I said, well, really the one thing that I can talk about most is the labor market effects. But I just wanted to throw up some other areas that economists or other folks who are looking at economic effects consider. There is the consideration of firm-level production decisions. Are firms in need of a labor supply that's not available in their local labor market that may prompt them to seek labor elsewhere? We can talk about then, do immigrants have a positive productivity effect? Are there effects of innovation by bringing in immigrant workers? Do we see that by maybe changing their inputs more on the labor supply and less on the capital side, are firms more efficient? That goes sort of counter, though, to what we usually think of as efficiency is usually gained through investments in capital and technology. But some people argue that there might be some productivity gains by bringing in immigrant workers. Then there's consumer markets, so lots of activity around the effect of immigration on prices, and the argument, sort of the dominant argument there is that immigration brings prices down for U.S. consumers, so that's good for U.S. consumers. Immigration is good for growth in the consumer market, simply because you've got now more consumers in the U.S. Immigrants are consumers and workers. So that growth, the population growth, is an important stimulus to demand in the U.S. economy. So there are all sorts of ways to cut up the economic effects question. I just wanted to make sure that I made you aware of that. I'm sure you already are, but just to say I'm not talking about those things today, and I'm going to focus exclusively on the labor market. Okay, so usually the discussion in the US centers around this question of job competition. And I'm going to talk about it now, and then I'm going to talk about it a little bit later in my talk around some of my own work. So public and scholarly discourse usually accents this idea of competition between immigrants and natives in the labor market, and that is where there seems to be a lot of concern about the effect of immigration. Are immigrants taking jobs from natives? So there's been a lot of national opinion surveys around this question. I had listed on your references page the Migration Policy Institute. They have done some of these, but they're also a great source that will take you to many of these polls, like by the Pew Research Center and others, and they're sort of keeping tabs as these polls are done, and they sort of warehouse those results, so it's a good place to look. So a recent poll showed that 28% of all Americans think that immigrants do take native jobs. When they cut that by race, ethnicity, nativity, half of all African Americans believe that immigrants reduce job opportunities for African Americans. When you ask the same question, do immigrants reduce job opportunities for African Americans? When you ask that question of Latinos, 40% agree, so slightly less than the percentage of African Americans. So there is concern, and there is belief on the part of many people in the US that this is the effect of immigration. So here's where I basically give you one slide to summarize a vast literature. And in the readings that I gave you on the website, those readings will take you to the major scholarly work on this question. So, on the one hand, it's a very large literature with a lot of nuance and particularly a lot of disagreement around methodology. The easy part about this is that I can say the body of literature does not point with certainty to a predictable economic effects of immigration. That's the takeaway. It's pretty easy. So the cocktail party summation here, if somebody were to ask you, is that immigration has small to no wage effects on Native workers. And when I say small, negative and positive. There's a lot of disagreement about whether there's a positive effect or negative effect, but all effects that have been found, with the exception of the work of George Borjas, have been relatively small. And the small effects there have been, though, there is strong, or I guess I should say, somewhat of consensus on the second one, that there are small effects on unemployment among the lowest skilled Native workers. Okay? But they're very small. But that's a fairly uniform finding across the literature. Now, I raise this question because I'm working on questions of gender. I say probably here because I think there needs to be a lot more research. My bet is that this is probably exclusive to men. So to the lowest skilled men in the labor market, native-born men. Now, here's the kicker. The clearest wage and unemployment effects have been found on other immigrants. Now, that makes a lot of sense, and this is why. We talk about if there's going to be competition, workers need to be pure substitutes for one another, right? If you're going to compete for my job, you need to look a lot like me. You need to have a degree in urban geography, you need to have a PhD, you need to study similar things that I do, and if you do that, I'm nervous, because then it's a close call about who's going to get the job. But if you don't, if your bundle of skills doesn't look like mine and actually looks vastly different from mine, you're not a threat, right? And actually there might be a lot of what we call complementarity. So this is the argument that comes around with dual labor market theory particularly, and I'll run you through this in a moment, but maybe I'll just do it now, but you'll see the slide later. In global city hypothesis, the global city idea is that you have global cities like Chicago, but particularly like New York, London, and Tokyo, where you have very high wage, high skilled earners, right? And what they're doing is they're working a lot. And so they need a lot of support to kind of enable them to work the hours that they do. So then they create a demand for housekeepers, babysitters, dog walkers, dry cleaning services, restaurants, right? Because these are all things that used to be internal to the home and the home economics. Now we're making external and bringing to the market, the public market. So there's complementarity between a very high wage financial services sector worker and then a lower skilled immigrant who's willing to work in a restaurant for lower wages. But now though you can understand, if I'm that lower skilled immigrant and I'm trying to get a job in a restaurant, there are a whole lot of other workers that look just like me. And that's who I'm competing most against. So it's actually longer term immigrants are most, they're the ones who should be most concerned about new immigration, because they're the ones who feel that effect most directly. Now we even see the longer you stay though in the US, the further and further away you get from that competition effect. And that makes sense because you've now gained experience in the US labor market, which is critical for an immigrant. You know how the system works, you know what's expected, you know what to do. You've maybe even picked up some English, right? And so as you stay, and so we tend to look at these groups when we do it in the data, 5-year cohorts. As you get further away, you're less vulnerable, if you will, to that effect. Okay, so This is, I really do think that the New York Times Magazine piece from 2006 that I posted on the website is such an excellent primer on this whole debate. I so wish that in my first year in grad school that would have been available, because I had to wade through all this literature, and the reporter does a very good job, I think, of capturing the tenor of the debate in the academy. What he does is he really goes to the source, and it really has been a debate that that David Card, who's an economist at UC Berkeley, and George Borjas, who's at Harvard, have kind of been the front runners on. But there's lots of research that's happened by other folks as well. Basically, how this breaks out is that George Borjas says, listen, there are clear negative effects of immigration on native-born workers, and we need to be very concerned about this. And the primary impact is felt by lower-skilled native-born workers, particularly young black men. And so that's his stance. Interestingly, he's a Cuban immigrant. Interestingly, David Card is a Canadian immigrant as well. He says, listen, you know, I'm not seeing these effects. I'm seeing no effects, very small effects, even positive effects. Now, the positive effects, I do want to clarify, because this is a more general finding among researchers, is that among higher wage earners, we actually see a positive boost to our wages as a result of immigration. And there's a whole set of reasons why. But that's one place where we actually argue if you're more skilled, you're actually maybe seeing a boost. One of the arguments is, well, I don't know if you're feeling it these days, given the Great Recession, but we used to use teachers as an example in this case, not on so much wages, but on employment, in that immigrants come, they have families, they have kids who need to go to school. That spurs demand for teachers, right, and can actually expand the market for teachers. And so there's a positive employment effect on teachers as a result of that. Okay, so getting back, if you want, we can talk about this in your, as you're drawing up lesson plans. I don't teach high schoolers, so I'm unfamiliar with the best way to go about this, but really what these differences come down to are fairly, it's a lot of inside baseball, if you will. There are a lot of methodological decisions that are made by these researchers that bring about these different results. And so there's a lot of debate around the methodology that undergirds these different studies. Basically, one of the main differences that we see here are researchers who either look at the nation as a whole, so they get a big fat data set, and they just say, okay, what's the effect of all immigrants in the US on all native-born workers in the US? What's the outcome? And that's the work of George Borjas. Now that makes a lot of sense, particularly from a policy perspective. If you're saying, as a nation state, what should our immigration policy be? Now, I do want to clarify, though, that I don't think that economic effects are the only issue that we should consider when we're considering immigration policy. But it does become an important factor that we discuss in political debate. So if you're saying, what should the US do around immigration? What are the labor market effects? Okay, that approach makes sense. Also, so I'll come back to that in just a moment. David Card says, well, listen, the effects of immigration are uneven. And as an urban geographer, I agree with this perspective. So immigrants don't evenly spread themselves across the US. They tend to go to particular places, to particular cities, to particular regional locales. And so it makes sense then to engage in a local labor market analysis. And in the interest of full disclosure, these are the types of statistical analyses that I engage in. I look at local labor markets. So we say, okay, let's though look at places like LA, where there's a very high number of immigrants, and actually a very small percentage of African Americans. I haven't looked at my most recent census data, but I think I can say with some certainty that the percentage of African Americans in LA is under 10%, And the percentage of foreign-born workers is over a third of the Los Angeles population. So there, it's a very different dynamic than someplace like Durham, North Carolina, although we are seeing a lot of new immigration. But the balance of factors, I should say, the proportion of different types of workers differ across labor markets. And so some of us say, well, that's really what we should look at then. That's the unit of analysis that we should be concerned about. And in those types of analyses, we've seen, again, no effects or very small effects, particularly on wages. And there I think it's, where are we most concerned about asking the question about the impact on whom? Now, George Borjas has said, though, listen, one of the reasons that we can't just look at local labor markets is that they're not fully contained. People migrate between local labor markets. And it could be that native-born workers leave labor markets with high numbers of immigrants. So we might see out-migration, for instance, from Los Angeles to other labor markets as a result of immigration. And particularly a number of population geographers work on that question. And they've seen that immigration has possibly prompted some of that out-migration of native-born workers, but to the benefit of those native-born workers. After they migrated, they actually found better jobs, evaluated on a number of different factors. Okay, I do want to end on, because I do think that this is a fun thing to talk about with students, particularly if they're interested in maybe pursuing more quantitative work or are interested in statistics or even economics. David Card is well known for being, he's sort of brilliant at what we call the natural experiment. And he's used this technique to address a number of different questions. And again, in the New York Times Magazine article, the reporter talks about this as well. But a very, very famous study that he did was looking at the Muriel boat lift effect. So in 1980, Cuba put a bunch of people on a boat, 150,000 people, and said, you can leave. And folks said, okay, we're going. And the U.S. opened its borders to those Murielitos. So they arrive literally overnight in Miami, and most of them stay in Miami. That's critical. So now you have a perfect natural experiment about what the immediate effect of immigration is on a labor market, right? Yesterday they weren't here, so you can measure what unemployment and wages look like among native-born workers. Literally the next day you flood the labor market, an increase of 7% on the numbers of workers overnight. What's the effect? So David Card saw this as, a great natural experiment, and he followed out what the effects were over a 5-year period. Well, lo and behold, we actually see no negative unemployment effects on native-born workers, especially on native-born black workers, and actually lower unemployment effects among native-born African-American or native-born black workers than in other cities, than in their statistical counterparts in other cities. So actually, this had a very positive effect for those African-American workers. And the big question is why? And that's really where the debate continues to be. And David Card doesn't really know why. He said, listen, this was an empirical test to see what the effect was. And I can tell you that it was a positive effect. It's either no effect or a positive effect on wages and unemployment of African Americans. So the question is, how is it that the American economy can absorb all of these workers, and particularly in Miami, almost overnight, and then actually have very positive effects as a result? So that's sort of a fun question to muse over, which there's no definitive answer at this point, except for we are there, well, it's hard to say now given the Great Recession, but particularly at this moment of time, there was a lot of growth and innovation that was occurring in that Miami labor market, and we can speculate related to the fact that there was immigration there, that actually drove some of that growth and innovation. Okay, so I do want to raise this issue of low-wage work within the U.S. as a whole that doesn't affect just immigrants. And here we have very clear empirical results around what the nature of that low-wage labor market looks like. And I just wanted to throw this in so that we could start thinking about questions that are related to but apart from immigration that help us to say, maybe, is this a question of immigration or is this a question of something else, right? And this is the type of work that I do. So in recent years, there's been a lot of very interesting research on the nature of low-wage work. And what we have learned from this work is that the conditions of low-wage work are dictated predominantly by political factors. So because of the erosion of the real value of a minimum wage, we've seen plummeting wages in these jobs. So between 1997 and 2007, there was no increase in the federal minimum wage. Not only was there no increase, but we do not peg the minimum wage to inflation. So it was actually losing in real value terms. This had a huge effect on the nature of jobs that we consider low wage or those secondary sector jobs. We've also seen an really startling erosion of employment protections. So wage and hour violations, we've seen not only violations, but the removal of overtime protections in many states, and that this has really changed the nature of work in the secondary labor market over the last 10 to 15 years. Again, minimal enforcement of wage and hour violations. So you could say, well, listen, even if it's low-wage work and it's not protected by a union contract, there is law, right? There are federal labor standards that all employers must uphold. Well, employers uphold them if they want to, but they can also choose not to, even though that's illegal. But what are the chances of getting caught? Very, very low, because we have very few inspectors in the Department of Labor to actually carry out this oversight and enforcement. And under the Bush administration particularly, we saw fewer and fewer of these DOL inspectors out in the field. Under the Obama administration, there has been a slight increase under Secretary Solis, actually in response to some of this work on low wage, on the low wage labor market. So the Russell Sage Foundation, a year or two ago, and I can find this report, I actually meant to and need to send it to Jamie and to put it on as one of your website resources. They used a very interesting statistical technique which allowed them to go into the low-wage labor market and actually produce results that are considered random. So that's very important in statistics, because we don't have information beyond information that, like, I look at in the census, that's collected by the census. We know, though, there's a lot of work that never gets reported, right? There's a lot of work in the informal economy. And so we just didn't know really how to gather information about that kind of work. So they used a very interesting statistical technique that allowed them to actually gather results that are considered random and then statistically testable. And what they were able to find, and so they found work that was informal as well as formal work, but what was very surprising was that work that was formal, they found a very high rate of violation of basic fair labor standards laws, right? So we know, and people in the field, and particularly activists who are working on this issue, call one of these violations wage theft. So this is the example of workers who are asked to work off the clock. So go in and clock out, and now I want you to go stock those stock rows, 21 and 22. Or you're asked to come in early and prep before you clock in, right? Or for the more extreme example, are day laborers who, are picked up at a corner outside of a Home Depot, and it's a contract that's basically made on the spot, right? We call it a spot market. Hey, will you come work for me today to help me with my landscaping in my backyard? Although it's usually not individuals, we know it's more contractors who will actually go and pick up these day laborers. And the day laborer goes and they work Saturday, they come back to the corner Sunday, they're picked up, they work the rest of the day, and they're finished working and nobody's there. and so they're not paid, and then they have to walk home from wherever they are. This is actually very common. And we used to think that it was maybe these were kind of exceptional cases, they were bad apples, but we really have seen a systemic problem with these sorts of issues. I wanted to bring this up because we do see a concentration of immigrants in these low-wage jobs, and the question is, you know, which is driving which? Okay, so, maybe let me just back up because I've got a few minutes on this question. Just as musings, these are sort of some of the questions that I deal with about, particularly around issues of the primary and secondary labor market. We may say, like Michael Piore, who says, listen, you will always have these low-wage jobs. It's a structural condition of capitalism. That may well be, but also if you look historically, we can see that jobs that were once low-wage became good-paying jobs. And this actually happened in the hotel sector, in meat packing and processing, and many manufacturing jobs. At the turn of the last century, when there was a high concentration of immigrants in these jobs, they were very low-wage, dangerous jobs. And then through a whole set of factors, unionization being one, but also then the development of the modern welfare state and passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1935, we actually see the floor raised on these jobs. And many of them become, if not solidly middle-class jobs, solid working-class jobs that provided people with some sort of security and retirement, you know, a modest home or apartment, opportunities for the educational advancement for their children. So that is the historical trajectory of many of those jobs. This is why I point to these political factors, and David Card has actually written looking at a number of these factors and their effects on work. What happens when you have an erosion of the minimum wage, right? What happens when you have an erosion of these fair labor standards or worker protections? All of a sudden you see these jobs becoming more like secondary segment jobs than primary segment jobs. So the question is, which came first, that or the immigrant, right? Did the immigrant turn that primary segment job, or at least decent working class job, into a low-wage job? Or did the job become a low-wage job from once being a very good working class or middle class job and then filled by an immigrant? It's a chicken and egg question, and we don't definitively know the answer, but that's where one of the key debates is. Okay, so I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try and go through these last set of slides pretty quickly. This is just a few pieces pulled out of my own research where I'm looking at what we call the ethnic racial division of labor, where I'm asking the question of basically who's working what jobs. And when I say who, I'm looking at race, ethnicity, nativity, gender. I want to know who's doing what where. And for this, I'm looking at Chicago. I've also done a lot of this work looking at Los Angeles. So here's something that I think is important that has changed somewhat now with the Great Recession. So I want to say that. We have seen that immigration flows have come down somewhat as a result. So we're not quite seeing the same trajectory. But what was very interesting about Chicago, which was similar for a number of major US cities, is that Chicago actually had negative population gains for 50 years, from 1950 to 2000, or I'm sorry, from 1950 until 1990. So you're looking at what was happening through the 40s up through the 80s, had negative population gain. Lo and behold, we start turning around. So between 1990 and 2000, we actually gain in population by 4%. Well, who's responsible for that? Primarily immigrants. So this gets to that issue of, well, what's the effect of immigrants? Here you can argue that there's a stimulus effect of some sort. There's growth in Chicago. There's going to be growth in that local consumer market, particularly. So now I just want to, because I know most of you are from Chicago, I know not all, but just to give you some numbers, pulled from the US Census 2005-2007 American Community Survey. These are 3-year estimates. These numbers may look slightly different than what you can pull from other sources. I do want to say be careful about Wikipedia because they're double counting often. So if you ever pull numbers from Wikipedia, make sure to add them up, because what happened is that we've now allowed people to check multiple boxes on race and ethnicity, and I think there are very good reasons to do that. But then statistically, you have to be very careful how you're counting folks, because lots of times people count people twice if they counted 2 boxes. So these are my own numbers that I've gone through and cleaned this data set. So that's why they may not look exactly what you might just pull from the web, and I just want to say be cautious as a consumer of that kind of demographic data. So about 22% of Chicago's population was foreign-born in 2007. If you divide, oh, that's a very funny slide. I don't know why that's doing that. Oh well, that's very odd. What I'm asking you to look at is at the pie chart, which might be difficult. Basically, what I'm doing is saying, okay, of that 20% of the foreign-born population, we can see that actually a high percentage, a quarter of them, have arrived very recently. They're very recent immigrants. They've arrived after 2000. And the other 3/4 have arrived before 2000. So remember that those recently arrived immigrants are probably going to have the most effect in the labor market on the folks in the purple part of that bar on the chart. This is very interesting about Chicago. There aren't very many cities that have a very balanced demographic profile, if you will. You can see we're about a third, about a third Latino, a third non-Hispanic white, and a third black. So I just wanted to throw that out, and this is why I think it is important to look at the context of a local labor market, because they differ. That pie chart will look extremely different in Los Angeles, if I were to throw Los Angeles up there, or New York, for instance. So here, what I'm trying to say, though, what Chicago gives you is kind of a perfect test case of these effects of competition, if you will, because we've got a large number of blacks, a large number of Latinos, and a large number of whites, and now we can kind of see what the effect might be. But particularly because most of the non-Hispanic black population are native-born blacks. Very few of them are foreign-born, although I know we've got one in the audience somewhere. Here, though, I want to also make sure that we keep in mind what the demographic legacy of Chicago has been. It has always been both an immigrant city and a black metropolis, right? So we've always been dealing with this issue of immigrant incorporation and African American incorporation in the city as well as the labor market specifically. So this goes back to that global city narrative that I was talking about, that the argument here is that we have globalization-driven restructuring brings about the shift from manufacturing to services, but in particular cities become the command and control centers for global capitalism. Now, Chicago is important because the commodity exchange is here, right? A lot of financial transactions occur in Chicago, and the argument has been that these are very important cities because of that type of work. They also then, through agglomeration effects, which is something that geographers and I talk about a lot, bring in other very highly skilled labor and services as a result. There's a lot of producer services that support that kind of those sort of capital command and control functions. What you get in a place like Chicago is a fairly bifurcated labor market. You got a lot of high-end jobs and a lot of low-end jobs. I do want to say, though, there are still those precious middle-level jobs here, and many of those are public sector jobs, right? The public sector is really buoying up that middle class sector, particularly in major metropolitan areas like Chicago. So the question becomes then, where are the native-born workers? The argument here is that native-born workers, particularly lower-skilled workers, would shun these jobs, so we're just not going to see them, and we're going to have very high rates of unemployment. It is true we do have higher rates than on average of unemployment among African-American workers, but this also differs by gender, and this is one of my contributions to the literature, that oftentimes what we do is we just throw in all natives together and all immigrants together, or we only look at men. But what we do know is that the labor market is most segmented or segregated, you can use either word, although sociologists tend to use the word segregated, by gender. It's more segregated by gender than any other characteristic, than by race, than by ethnicity, than by nativity. So men and women do tend to work very different jobs. That said, I'm going to ask, okay, so who's working in these typical immigrant jobs in the global city? And one of the jobs that is often thrown up as a case study is hotel work, and particularly hotel housekeeping. It's, perfectly primed as an immigrant job. It's manual labor, it's in the service sector, it requires little to no formal education, it happens back of the house, you don't have contact with consumers, or it's rare, unless you're being sexually harassed, I guess. And so it becomes a place that you can see immigrants, moving into. It tends to be lower wage. This was an average from 2000. That number is very different, primarily because of a very important union contract that was signed several years later, but I'll come back to that at the end. So what we have here, though, is that even in a typical immigrant job like hotel housekeeping, we see considerable employment of native-born blacks. So even though immigrants predominate in hotel housekeeping in the Chicago labor market, 39% of those jobs are held by native-born women, and most of those are African-American women. So 27% of all hotel housekeepers in Chicago are African-American women. And both immigrant and African-American women count hotel housekeeping as what we call a niche job. What do we mean by a niche job? It's a job in which you're overrepresented given what your percentage share of the labor market is, right? So if African-American women are 10% of the labor market, if they had a parity share, we would expect them to hold 10% of all hotel housekeeping jobs. And what we call their niche factor would be 1. But in fact, we see that African-American women are 2.5 times overrepresented in hotel housekeeping. It's an important job for them. They're overrepresented in that job, as are other immigrant groups like foreign-born Mexicans, who are more concentrated in that job at 4 times. But still we can see that there is great importance, that this job is important for African-American women. They depend upon it to a greater degree than they depend upon other jobs in the labor market. But you might ask, well, what's happening though over time? So I looked at 1990 to 2000 because this was a decade of very large increases in the immigrant labor force in Chicago, and I need to wrap up here very quickly. But we can see that African-American women did experience a drop in their share of all housekeeping jobs from 32 to 27%, yet the immigrant share grew more rapidly. So that's a puzzle, because then you would expect African-American women to have lost many more jobs than they did. So how do we explain it? Well, you could explain it with growth, but actually there was stagnant growth in the hotel industry. Mostly it was explained by the exit of native-born white workers from that job. And that is something that is I can't say that it's fully generalizable across the US, but in many similar studies like this one, we find that actually it's native-born whites who are leaving these jobs, right? So if you want to characterize that as a competition effect, then that's where the competition is felt. But many scholars have said, no, this is more about the native-born whites finding other employment in the labor market, usually higher wage, better compensated work, or they're also aging out of these jobs. So it's not really a negative effect, and in many cases it's a positive effect as younger white workers are moving up into different types of jobs. By the way, if you look at all African Americans across all occupations in the hotel industry, they actually gained in share in that sector between 1990 and 2000. So it very well could be, and I haven't cut up all the occupational divisions, but I know that many more African American men found jobs in the hotel industry, and we do see many more African American men, or African American workers at what we call front of the house jobs. So the concierge services and such like, HR department. So this raises the question of, is this competition or coexistence? And I'm going to end on this and one other slide. So what I decided to do is then cut up the entire Chicago labor market, because, you know, I'm just picking hotel housekeeping. I'm kind of looking where I expect to find effects. And I find an opposite effect of what's found in many other studies that look at hotels. So I decided to cut up the entire Chicago labor market and look at how we see changes in the share of African Americans in jobs compared to the share of immigrants. And I divide by gender. I'm just going to talk about what I find for women. I can talk with you at break about what I find for men, where there is a more negative, or what I might characterize more of a competition effect. But here we see that there's a lot of overlap, actually an increasing overlap between African American women and immigrant women into similar jobs between 1990 and 2000. Whereas they were working in more separate jobs in 1990, they're actually converging into the same sorts of jobs by 2000. And unfortunately, these tend to be lower wage, secondary segment type of jobs. Home health care is the most noticeable one. Part of this is about a huge boom in this industry over this decade, and so it was hungry for new workers. And who did it pull in? Immigrant women and African American women, very high rates. Child care. Lots of African American women and immigrant women working in these jobs. By the way, these jobs are all ones that I characterize as having both these groups of workers being overrepresented, right? Nursing care, outpatient care, and other industries like employment services, beauty salons, hotels, and hospitals. But what do I take away from this? That really what we're seeing then is a shared experience of economic inequality. So African American women are gaining in the jobs which are most dramatic, or their gains are most dramatic in lower paying, deprofessionalized, but expanding health sectors, particularly in care work, what we might call care work. And immigrant women made gains in these jobs as well. So both groups are increasingly sharing an experience of inequality shaped by the devaluation of women's work and the downgrading of care work jobs. So for instance, much of this work used to happen in hospitals in more professional settings, right, where you had to have a certificate of some sort, you're often union, if you're a nurse's aide. Now that work is being spun out of hospitals into these outpatient care centers, into home health care, and the work itself is becoming highly deprofessionalized, much more unstable, and with fewer job protections. And so this was my point that actually in Chicago we see that rates of working poverty are very similar among African American families and immigrant families, and increasingly so. They're increasingly looking quite similar on this measure of economic prosperity or not prosperity. You'll see them on my PowerPoint presentation that's loaded, but the similarities. Here we have immigrant Latinos have the highest rate of working poverty in Chicago, or this is actually Cook County, these data, 39%. All immigrants at a rate of 29%, and African Americans right behind them with a rate of 27%, and whites are much, much lower. And then I just wanted to end on this, that we're seeing, though, increasing political engagement around the conditions of low-wage work, and I think particularly in response to the Great Recession, we're seeing that around public sector work, like the case of Wisconsin. Here's a photo from Civil Disobedience Act 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, on Michigan Ave in Chicago, and this is the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union, which has a high representation among African American and immigrant workers. So I know it's but one example, but we're seeing at least in Chicago how these issues are playing out politically of these workers really coming together to address the conditions of low-wage work in their industry. Thank you. Right. So when I say African American, those are native-born black workers. And there are very few, I mean, there of course are African immigrants in the Chicago labor market, but as a percentage compared to the African American population, very small and negligible enough that they don't change any of the results in any of these models. I didn't mean to dismiss it, that's how we broadly think of migration, right? But then we need to specify more exactly what are those push-pull factors, and that's what these theories try to do. All of them say yes, they're a push-pull. So, but a difference would be a neoclassical model privileges those economic factors. We do know that the vast majority of immigrants here, well, or this is how we conceive of them, are economic immigrants, that they come for reasons, for economic reasons. Now, let me qualify that in just a moment. We do know, though, that there are lots of other reasons that folks come, and this is why this question of migration politically, I think, is important, that we think broadly beyond just economic factors, because Borjas, as he tells his story, they're forced out, right? It's a dictatorship regime that comes in. They're of the capitalist class, they own a factory, and so they're not supportive of Fidel, and so they leave. Whereas David Card's conditions, I don't know the exact conditions, but I assume that he comes for career reasons, right? He gets a very prestigious job at the University of California, Berkeley. So yes, those are all factors. It's that then how the theories specify what those push-pull factors are or how they privilege them is what I was driving at. That then you start sort of saying, okay, let's parse them out. What are the differences between different push-pull factors? And the world systems theory is the more comprehensive and would link many of these economic factors to political factors, like colonialism, right? That their political instability often comes about from engagements of first world countries in developing world contexts. So, and we do see this. If you look at France, right, the highest volumes of migrants to France are from their former colonial countries, right? And in the Netherlands, the same thing. In Germany, with the experience with the Gastarbeiter program, with the Turks. So that's what they're explaining, is that those sorts of relationships, both economic and political, are crucial for understanding migration flows. No, and I think that, this is where you're experts pedagogically in teaching this age level. I am not. So I would say probably sticking with push-pull is the way to do it. For my students, we then say, okay, push-pull, but now specify, what's more, to be more exact about it. There's, that's when I think it's great to draw upon, more autobiographical accounts or fictional accounts. This weekend in the New York Times Magazine, there's a story by Jose Antonio Vargas, who's an undocumented immigrant who very publicly came out in this piece. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and he's just announced to the world, I'm an undocumented immigrant, and tells the story of how he arrived as a child where he had no choice, right? He didn't make the decision to come. His family made the decision to come, and for him to come, and lo and behold, he's here. So that leads to a second point, which I realize I should have included a slide. These are the theories that explain what prompts migration. Now, why do we continue to have migration? And that's where we go to a network effect. That once folks are here, now it's a network-driven process, especially because that's what our immigration policy rests upon, around family contacts. So once somebody comes, so the question around these theories is, okay, why does somebody come first? But once somebody comes first, then that creates the channel to others at home. So the question is, what is then the effect of immigration on the next generations, the children of immigrants, what we call either the 1.5 generation or the second generation? And it's only been very recently that we've been able to ask this question, because the kids of the first post-1965 wave of immigration are my age now, or a little younger. And so now we're kind of clearly in our working careers, and we can kind of see where people are. So it's only been with this last census that we've been able to really ask that question. And again, there's, results are, there's no consensus, although what we do tend to see is that they look more like their native-born counterparts than immigrants. And so in that sense, they're not substitutes. And so that's where in many of these wage models, this is my own work, I do this as well, I look at the effect of immigrants on other immigrants, and I usually do it by national origin, and then on their native-born counterparts, which is tricky because now they're a pan-ethnic category, right? But so I look at the effect of Mexicans on native-born Latinos, and we tend to not see that there's very minimal, if any, effects on those groups. It's really the earlier arrived immigrants where we see the effects. So then the question becomes actually, so are native-born Latinos, second generation, are they more like native-born blacks? And are they experiencing the same sorts of challenges that other native-born minorities are experiencing? And that's the question that researchers are questioning. And what some of the differences, this is segmented assimilation theory, and I can throw some books at you. Alejandro Portes is the leading scholar in this field, and they raise questions about protective factors. So do you have, is there sort of an insular culture that might protect these kids, or are these kids ending up in poor, more dangerous, quote unquote, neighborhoods where they're exposed to factors that are put them at risk for later success in the labor market? And so that's the line of questioning that these scholars have pursued for the second generation. So the question was, what do we mean by 1.5 generation? And those are individuals who came to this country as children. And what we consider very important about their acculturation process is were they adolescents in the US? So did they experience adolescence in a US context? And usually they look then, exactly like their native-born counterparts because of that experience of adolescence in the child development process. David Card, again, so he uses another natural experiment, and so the doctrine of the economics field has been exactly this, that if you raise the minimum wage, you're going to stave off employment, and there are going to be fewer opportunities in the labor market. So David Card, again, engaged in a natural experiment where he was able to exploit a raise in the minimum wage in New Jersey, or I think I have this right. I'm blanking right now, but I can get you the exact details in a moment. But in the Northeast, one state raises their minimum wage, the other state doesn't. And so then he looks at the conditions of employment in the fast food industry and sees that there's no effect. And so then he and another author, Alan Kruger, did a number of studies and really turned the mainstream economics establishment on its head by saying, listen, there are this is an empirical question, and there are no discernible negative effects of unemployment by raising the minimum wage. The catch, why? Because we've never raised in recent history the minimum wage high enough to ever reach that point. So he says it's an empirical question on where that threshold is, but we're not even close to it. So the minimum wage is so low that even our recent increases to that minimum wage have not even come close to reaching whatever that threshold is, and we don't really know what it is, right? That would then begin to have an employment effect. I don't know that area probably as well as the person who talked about it yesterday, but this is the main consensus, is that so there's been a lot of research, particularly since the TANF rules changed in 1997, which then states were allowed to decide if immigrants were eligible for basically welfare. And so a lot of research over the last decade on the rate of use of social services by immigrants. We know that it's much lower than their native-born counterparts, and yet we know that they are paying in at the same rates as their statistical counterparts in terms of property taxes, Social Security, particularly Social Security, which they never get back because they're using a number that's not really theirs. So, of course, there are costs to supporting these folks, but most of the research has shown that it's offset by the taxes that they pay in, even as they earn lower wages and probably pay lower property taxes because the value of the either their home or the apartment that they're renting is lower than other folks. I can send those to you. Yes, there's a whole number, and if Jamie would make a note of that, I can send you a few references to send you to that literature.
Thank you very much.